My name is Bob Pasnow. I'm a professor of philosophy here and the director of the Center for Western Civilization, Thought and Policy, which is sponsoring tonight's talk. Bishop Katharine Jefferts Schori is getting to be like a member of the family almost. This is her second extended visit here. Some of you will know she was here back in the fall, and it's just been such a pleasure to have her around and involved in just all kinds of different things. At St. Aidan's and on campus. At lunch today, we met in a small group of the fellows of the center around a table and talked about the theme of the center for this year, which is freedom and security, and we just had the most wonderful, wide-ranging discussions about how freedom and security interact and about privacy, and we got into social media and the kinds of sacrifices people make to be involved in social media in terms of their own privacy and sometimes their freedom and security. And that was just a treat. Tonight's talk is a bit different, but for those of you, there must be a few in here that don't know as much as they might like about Bishop Katharine. Let me just give you just a brief background. Her background is actually in science. Her undergraduate degree from Stanford was in biology, and she went on to get a Ph.D. in oceanography. And then she turned towards the church at some point, got a Master's of Divinity in 1994, and then eventually became the presiding bishop of the Episcopalian Church beginning in 2006, a position she held for 9 years, the most senior leadership position in the Episcopalian Church in the country. And indeed, she was the first woman to hold that position, not just in the United States, but across the whole Anglican Church worldwide. Absolutely a remarkable achievement. Tonight, the topic of her lecture will be the measure, dimension, and intersectionality of truth. So, Bishop Katharine.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a delight to be here again. What is truth? How do we define or discern what's true and what's not? Stephen Colbert offered a neologism more than a decade ago that speaks into our society's willingness to judge truth by what feels or seems to be true. The purely emotional assertion of truthiness without resort to facts, evidence, logic, or intellectual rigor characterizes an awful lot of our national and global dialogue at the moment. It probably has done so for a long time. Fake news is a more intentional assertion of truth when the reporter knows that a story is false, yet seeks to spread propaganda for financial or political profit, or to discredit a person or a larger community. The tactic has been around for a long time. In the Garden of Eden, Adam accuses Eve of leading him astray, and Eve puts the blame on the serpent. And readers of that story in millennia since have often blamed Eve for all the world's ills. That's not in the text. We search for truth in myriad ways, but just what do we expect to find? The English word comes from an ancient root that means to be firm or solid or steadfast. The same root also yields tryst and trust and betroth. As it developed in English, the basket of meanings came to include things like faith and faithfulness, fidelity, loyalty, but also pledge and covenant and veracity. Truth in this set is about predictability in relationship and an outward or inward signifier of that constancy. To plight one's troth is to promise a constant and dedicated relationship. A tryst is a trusted waiting place or a meeting that is confidently expected. By the late Middle Ages, truth in English comes to mean the quality or state of being true. Things like accuracy, correctness, factual, principled, reflecting what actually happened, as well as honesty, candor, sincerity, and veracity. The Latin word for truth, veritas, comes from a related root, and it too means true or trustworthy, and yields other words like verity and verisimilitude and verify. This constellation of meanings is about the character of an individual, as well as the character of that person's actions or reports or news. It's an ethical term. The Greek word for truth, aletheia, means uncovered or revealed, as opposed to hidden or concealed, or oblivious or forgotten. That would seem to be the direct antithesis of fake news. And perhaps it echoes that old proverb in vino veritas, meaning that a person in his cups is less likely to hide the truth. Much of the etymological history in the West elucidates truth as characteristic of a person or that person's behavior or speech. Truth is known in relationship, as words and acts are experienced over time. There's another philosophical strand that sees truth, together with goodness and beauty, as an ideal beyond the individual, in the sense of transcendental aspirations or realities. That transcendent character leads toward a dimension or understanding of ultimate truth. The challenge for postmodern people is whether truth exists independently of context, in some transcendent realm, or whether it can only be known to a degree of certainty in a particular time and place. On the way to wrestling with that challenge, let's consider what dimension truth inhabits. Dimension is about measurement, and I want us to think mathematically or spatially about this for a minute. Can truth be zero-dimensional, like a point in space? Is it a scalar? Is a truth of magnitude 1 less trustworthy than a 10? Is truth a two-dimensional vector, a directional leaning, like the supposed predictive capacity of high school grades for college or vocational success? Can we think of truth as a tensor field, like current flow in the ocean and what it can predict about atmospheric conditions? Tensors exist at higher dimensions as well. The curvature of space-time of Einstein's general relativity is a tensor field of order 4, 3 spatial directions, dimensions, and time. The search for the underlying truth of the universe, a theory of everything, that reconciles all the particles and forces in the universe, at least as exercised by string theorists, routinely fiddles with 10 and 11 dimensional fields. Okay, a zero-dimensional truth might be the fact of Martin Luther King Jr.'s death date. It's 1 point in space-time. But the meaning of his prophetic speech is about a significantly higher dimensional truth, more like a tensor field. The temperature outside today can be measured in Fahrenheit or Celsius or Kelvin. The first scale is widely understood in the United States, but a second-order temperature might be reported in Celsius, and a third-dimensional one in Kelvin. For that series includes an expanding scale of universality. The location of this building is a kind of truth that might be measured by its postal address or its GPS address. Both define a specific point on the globe, but the first address is limited in understanding to an English-speaking community over a fairly short era in time. The geophysical address is also time-limited, but in a much longer and more universally understood framework, maybe a second-order truth. A third-order truth might locate this building on a celestial map, but the time-limited nature of all human physical construction might say that's more hubris than truth. If we look at celestial mechanics, we could name a similar range of scientific kinds of truth. For millennia, science taught a geocentric or Earth-centered universe. Muslim and Indian astronomers were teaching a heliocentric cosmos, at least by the 9th or 10th centuries, long before Copernicus woke up the Christian West. For centuries, Newtonian mechanics looked like a universal framework, until Einstein and his colleagues uncovered relativity and quantum mechanics. Seekers after truth come in similar orders. Those who are primarily interested in facts, those who want to know the causality behind the facts, and some who want to understand what, if anything, can be understood as universally true. People search for truth in science and other realms of communal human activity, in economics, politics, journalism, religion, sports, family life, and in ethical standards of right behavior. Truth of varying dimensions can be found in each milieu, from correct 21st century American English grammar to the rules of conduct in international sports, to an expectation of journalistic freedom, to treat your neighbor as you would want to be treated. The range passes from highly contextual correctness to more universal ethical norms, as truths that have prevailed over significant spans of human history, or maybe even the life of the universe. The life challenge of almost every human being moves from necessarily self-centered and other-dependent infancy to the need to negotiate shared understandings about livable conditions and tolerable behaviors, given our continuing need for human interdependence. For example, loud blaring music at 1 o'clock in the morning generates resentment because of some level of shared expectation and need for sleep. Scarfing all the coffee hour treats or bulldozing your way to the front of the buffet line may work in some contexts, but only in a local minimum in the ethical universe. They won't reach beyond an intensely ego-centered view of truth. The dimension of truth that satisfies a person's quest depends to a large extent on our view of the world. Is the urgent need centered on me and mine alone? Or is there room for curiosity and exploration? What makes the community across the mountains run differently to mine, or similarly? What are the universals? We can ask a parallel dimensional question about the goal or goals of truth-seeking. Correctness or being right would seem to be a zero or first-order kind of answer. Knowledge is about a more general or deeper set of truths in a particular sphere of inquiry. Wisdom has the character of higher-order truth and has almost always been understood as an ongoing search for more universal realities. If we can begin to see the multidimensional nature of truth and the seeking of it, it becomes more evident both that context matters and that the search for higher order truth is necessarily continuous, ongoing. Think again about a tensor field or the fabric of space-time. A local maximum or minimum may represent truth for a larger or smaller region, And it's not until wider areas are explored that we can begin to see the pervasiveness of its reach. We can trust in a local region that we've seen or experienced, but extrapolation is fraught with difficulties, for the next or nearby region of the field may be in some way aberrant. Moving to universals is the ongoing challenge. Yet there's a reasonably consistent set of developing human values about what right living looks like. For example, the golden rule. Like Occam's razor, it's simple and succinct. It's also applicable in most kinds of human encounter, and it's a minimalist frame that has to be applied in context to take on substantive local truth. Moving to universals in celestial mechanics has something to do with discerning how the basic structure of the universe, in particle or wave form, as mass or energy, how that takes varied shape in different contexts. We can draw a parallel between higher order truth and the fundamental structure, or DNA, if you will, of the universe. Variability is the contextual product of common life stuff, the cosmic stardust of which everything consists, given shape in nearly infinite variety. Chaos theory and its biological cousin, evolution, have shown us that tiny variations lead to the robust variety and diversity that we see wherever we look. Not only is everything composed of the same essentials, but there's a profoundly true relationship between mutability and the capacity for life. Hildegard of Bingen was a 12th century polymath. She was a nun, a scientist, a theologian, a physician, a mystic. Her search focused on what it means to live in truth. She connected the Latin word veritas, which means greenness, with veritas, truth, and wrote of human flourishing as veriditas, veriditas, capturing a sense of living truth. She imaged God, or truth, in human flesh as a green man, an image that's also present in the Celtic traditions. Truth takes shape or lives in varied guises, for it's grounded in what I'm calling higher order truth. Truth is also green in the sense that it grows, expands, and spreads into new contexts. It's generative and autopoietic, producing more of itself. That's at least some of how one gospel names Jesus, or the divine in human life, as way and truth and life. Truth may be multivalent and complex, yet the wider and larger, the higher order truths seem to share a core, simpler underlying reality. At the same time, if we're pursuing higher order truth, the truths we discern must always be open to testing and revision, whether they are scientific theories, religious doctrine, or ethical principles. They have to be living or green truths. Our capacity to discern higher order truth develops through our lives, through the process of living, often as the result of challenge or dissonance, both individually and in community. A local contextual truth may no longer provide explanatory or predictive capacity, and therefore has to be re-examined, researched, recognized, and reclaimed. Human beings almost always resist this process, at least at first, yet it's the route to higher order and more widely applicable truth. The process requires that we relinquish our previously firm definition of reality. That act or attitude of vulnerability to a new understanding might be seen as a marker of moving toward higher order truth. There are examples in the development of quantum mechanics and relativity, as well as the development of monotheism and universalizing religious traditions. The challenge has always involved asserting the universality of a more local and contextual truth. Human beings and our ancestors have made sense of the world by classifying some parts of the environment, some species, some life forms as not me or not us, and parts beyond that are defined as other or dangerous or enemy. That kind of truth is essential to immune systems that are designed to protect the life of both individuals and communities, yet it has to be opened up in order to discern a higher order truth. Let's see if we can apply this approach to the fearful nativism that is so present in this season of our common life. Wariness is an ancient response to a new or unknown stimulus. Babies spit out new foods when they're introduced. If they're encouraged, eventually they may begin to learn they're good to eat. If their parents hate peas and broccoli, the children are likely to grow up with a prejudice against what some small fry call green poison. I can remember my grandfather telling a story about hating celery until he was a teenager and tried it again, and discovering he liked it. Zero-order truth begins to expand, especially when encouraged by others with a wider experience. Attitudes toward novel stimuli are deeply shaped by cultural context. Poi is beloved in the Pacific and rejected by most North Americans. Some people can't imagine eating a squid. For others, the anathema may be stinky tofu, or a dish with jellyfish, or chicken feet. These tastes can be unlearned, but it takes a certain degree of will to keep trying the new dish and hunting for the good in it. Our attitudes toward comestibles have kept us from willy-nilly sampling newfound fungi and thus avoiding a death amanita. Yet wariness often wanes in time of famine when almost anything and everything becomes fit fodder. Similar attitudes toward the variety of humanity have fostered violence and wars since Neanderthals and Denisovans shared the landscape with an emerging species called Homo sapiens. At times they preyed on the others, and at other times, perhaps not terribly distant from one another, they clearly interbred. It reminds me of a lovely ode that Langdon Smith penned more than a century ago, titled Evolution. I'm not going to give you all of it, but a bit of it. It starts like this. When you were a tadpole and I was a fish in the Paleozoic time, and side by side on the ebbing tide we sprawled through the ooze and slime, or skittered with many a caudal flip through the depths of the Cambrian fen, my heart was rife with the joy of life, for I loved you even then. Mindless we lived, and mindless we loved, and mindless at last we died. And deep in the rift of the Caradoc drift we slumbered side by side. The world turned on in the lathe of time, the hot lands heaved amain, till we caught our breath from the womb of death and crept into life again. And in a later section, I flaked a flint to a cutting edge and shaped it with brutish craft. I broke a shank from the woodland lank and fitted it head and haft. Then I hid me close to the reedy tarn where the mammoth came to drink. Through the brawn and bone I drove the stone and slew him upon the brink. Loud I howled through the moonlit wastes. Loud answered our kith and kin. From west to east to the crimson feast, the clan came tramping in. O'er joint and gristle and padded hoof, we fought and clawed and tore, and cheek by jowl, with many a growl, we talked the marvel o'er. I carved that fight on a reindeer bone with rude and hairy hand. I pictured his fall on the cavern wall that men might understand. For we lived by blood and the right of might ere human laws were drawn, and the age of sin did not begin till our brutal tusks were gone. And at the very end of it, God wrought our souls from the Tremadoc beds and furnished them wings to fly. He sowed our spawn in the world's dim dawn, and I know that it shall not die. Though cities have sprung above the graves where the crook-bone men made war, and the ox-wain creaks over the buried caves where the mummied mammoths are, then as we linger at luncheon here, or many a dainty dish, let us drink anew to the time when you were a tadpole and I was a fish. We still wrestle with the relationship between tadpole and fish and the membership of our hominid clan. Who's in? Who's out? Who's safe? Who is not like us? Who is other, stranger, enemy? Human beings have walked a long road through that dark valley of decision. Is this one a death dealer or a life giver? How do we walk a road into the light of larger or higher order truth? Neurophysiologists have shown us that a lot of this decision-making is preconscious, originating in the most antique parts of our brain. A lot of the judgment about friend or foe is driven by equally subtle messages in the cultural environment. What kind of people does my family fear? Who hurt me yesterday on the playground? Whom have I been taught to trust? Our limbic systems generalize those messages to say things like, tall people are cruel, or round people in the kitchen are safe, or tattooed people are friendly. If we have the literal presence of mind in higher order parts of our brain and examine some of those generalizations, we might reject them or look for more evidence. But we have to manage our own level of fear and change our habits to come to different and more autonomous rather than automatic conclusions. All those cultural messages contribute not only to personal racism, sexism, prejudice, and phobias, but to the social norms that concretize discrimination and privilege. We all have it, we all do it, for none of us grew up in a prelapsarian Eden. Those preconscious judgments can be unlearned and replaced with higher order, more universal truths. But it takes the same kind of work as learning another language or learning to love your in-laws. The good news is that what's learned can be passed on to new generations. Like epigenetic changes, cultural inheritance can alter our offspring. Our mores have shifted over time as the more transcendent truth of created equal and made in the image of God have been proclaimed over centuries and millennia. The local contextual definition of those transcendent truths is where the rubber hits the road. The church that sent explorers across the seas in the 15th and 16th centuries gave them papal warrant to enslave peoples and expropriate lands where there were no Christians. It led to colonialism and the slave trade. Those warrants still underlie land law in these United States and have not been withdrawn. The enormities visited on indigenous peoples here and in Africa, as people were tortured and captured and sold and enslaved, are part of the result. We continue to hear things like, only people who worship like we do, or think like I do, and speak my language are really made in the image of God. Caveat emptor, for the divisions are easily turned inward as well. We have only to look at our bloody history of Reformation and Counter-Reformation in the Christian West, and the fissiparity of most religious traditions. Yet those same larger truths of human dignity and created in the image of God also prompted Bartolomé de las Casas to defend indigenous peoples from his fellow Spaniards, and gave rise to abolition movements on both sides of the Atlantic. Martin Luther King Jr. took his inspiration from the same truth and went to the mountaintop to look death in the face and opt for the long moral arc of the universe. The outrage we're witnessing around us right now isn't new, in that prejudice has been with us forever. Me Too and the child abuse scandals in sports and religious communities came as a last straw for people who had been abused and exploited once too often, and mighty has been the fall thereon. Yet the level of public outrage is evidence of a rising order in the dimension of cultural understanding of truth. When the Declaration of Independence was drawn up in response to the enormities of a different colonial power, it purported universality. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Yet a number of its framers and signers clearly disbelieved that men of English descent and men of African descent merited the same rights. It took another century before that was enshrined in law, a further century before some of the structural barriers to equality were removed, and we still have a very long way to go before it becomes broadly true in this nation's reality. The framers didn't see any truth in attempts to define men as inclusive of all human beings, whatever their gender. Nor did they believe that children had any significant rights except to be quiet and obedient. Even the status of a mature white male did not guarantee those rights if he didn't own land. We may have come some distance on the road toward higher level of truth, but we have miles to go before we will sleep in the village in peace. There's hope in looking behind us, for the universality of created equal is increasingly widely recognized. There's also hope in recognizing that habits and prejudgments often can be changed when we share a common vision. The application of truth in local contexts is the hard work of conscious self-examination in the face of that larger vision. Reading our history helps. When we hear politicians today make scurrilous judgments about immigration from outhouse nations, we might benefit from recalling who that included a century or more ago. Ireland, Italy, Poland, Russia, most European Jews. Until the 1920s, people traveled quite freely across our northern and southern borders, as well as to and from Cuba and other Caribbean islands, and much of the Americas south of us. Immigration quotas were placed on countries in Asia and Central and Southern Europe, but not in this hemisphere. The Border Patrol didn't exist until 1924. Exclusionary immigration policies have been highly targeted at certain ethnic and religious groups who have changed over time. We admitted hundreds of thousands of Chinese laborers who worked heavily in this part of the world when mines and railroads needed labor in the late 1800s. And then we slammed the door and deported many when economic conditions changed. Except for a few short periods, Mexican workers traveled quite freely back and forth across our southern border until the 1960s. The local application of a more universal truth that all are created equal gets sorted out in the midst of conflict. The very fact of conflict as difference of opinion scares some of us. Yet the trying and testing of truth is necessary to its larger recognition. A majority of Americans today believe that DACA recipients and dreamers deserve to remain in the United States and become citizens. Yet we do not yet see a political will to make that reality. Larger and less defined fears are conscripted into the debate in attempts to derail the train. When human beings are pushed back down into our brain stems for instinctual decision-making, the results are predictable. I want to argue for adding some fear antidotes to our conflict management tools in this work of helping higher order, greener truth to take root in local contexts. That work is deeply parallel to what I spoke about when I was here last fall. The ways in which truth is ratified in scientific and religious communities might help to foster better political discourse. A brief review. Both religious and scientific communities evaluate truth claims through testing them against inherited norms, which include theory as well as the wisdom of tradition. Major change takes place through scientific revolution or religious reformation, as a new expression of higher order truth displaces a more local or lower order truth. Examples include the search for a theory of everything in physics and cosmology, or the emergence of religious monotheism or monism. Migration policies and race relations are usually based on fairly local and time-bound truth, and they are propagated in political processes that incorporate contemporary cultural norms. The Declaration of Independence claims a certain level of transcendent, higher-order truth, and even though those claims have yet to be fully realized, the history of this nation has shown growing, if grudging, acceptance of the larger vision. That progress is painfully slow, as Black Lives Matter builds on the rising truth of civil rights and abolition. The tenacity of racism is the result of structures that developed to ossify fear, both among the targeted and the privileged. Fear is the enemy of larger truth. I want to suggest that continued evolutionary change can be encouraged by the same kinds of mechanisms that are often used to defeat practical application of higher order truth, by appealing to the deeper desires and hungers of human beings. Instead of fomenting fear by pushing those brainstem buttons, it is possible to invite reflection on common human experience and motivate compassion and justice seeking by touching other deeply human responses. There's a great example in a recent interview of Martha Radatz, who wrote The Long Road Home, about an army platoon that was ambushed in Baghdad in 2004. She tells of the emotional toll on the survivors, including more senior brass who were not directly involved. One of them broke into tears while talking to her. and he later confessed his lapse to his commanding general, apologizing for crying and letting him down. The response came back, "You would have let us down if you'd done anything else." War is hell. How do we find our common humanity and a higher order truth when it comes to immigration? Telling our stories is essential. I don't know a lot about my immigrant ancestors, but the family lore does say that the Irish ones left in the midst of the potato famine, and the Swedish ones, similarly poor, left primarily to avoid the draft in the late 1800s. They came seeking greater possibility in time of hunger, unemployment, and war. Why did your ancestors migrate here? Can you draw parallels with current global realities? The next question is about what we're willing to do about these causal realities, the hunger, the poverty, the violence in the world around us. Some clearly don't want to discuss it. Thank you very much. We've heard plenty of leave them to stew in their own mess recently. Yet the outrage in the face of what seems to many to be callous inhumanity tells us that higher order truth is at work within the community. Many have found the courage and the strength to begin to challenge inaction and injustice, again through stories and what they evoke. By getting to know migrants and refugees as human beings with stories much like ours. Host a conversation. Have a meal together. See what happens. Most people in this country recognize the unfairness of the plight of refugees, whose only fault has been to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. That touches a yearning for justice that applies to all. Americans routinely responded generously in time of natural disaster, giving money and their labor to aid in recovery. We saw it in the aftermath of Katrina, in the hurricanes that devastated the Caribbean and the American South last fall, and the recent fires and mudslides across the West. People have responded to suffering and injustice and are beginning to awaken to the connections with how we have exploited the goods of the earth and belched our exhaust into a planetary atmospheric sink that doesn't have an outlet. We're in this together, for good or ill. That dawning awareness bespeaks hope, particularly if we're willing to do the challenging work of applying the truth of caring for neighbors in our local contexts. That looks like the conscious welcome of the stranger, which gets easier with practice. And community agreement to do what we can for the suffering, even if we can't fix the problem. Solidarity changes things. It burnishes hope. It invites creative responses. And it gathers others into the growing confidence that change is possible and essential. The technical pieces of our policy will never be perfect, but they can be better and truer, more fully aligned with the higher order truths to which we give our hearts and souls. There's a wonderful poem that speaks to this kind of evolving journey in search of more transcendent truth. The author was a Mississippi lawyer and planter who fought for justice in the trenches of World War I and came home to witness the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. William Alexander Percy stood with the KKK's black targets and wrote, "The peace of God, it is no peace, but strife closed in the sod. Yet let us pray for but one thing, the marvelous peace of God. Or as Hildegard would say, the marvelous peace of truth. What would you like to talk about? Yes.
So, get a microphone here.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I was thinking about when you were talking about truth, and in the Enlightenment, truth, it seemed like became, and much up to our day, something that can be scientifically proven. That, if it's not something that's quantifiable or definable, is probably not true. It was a moving away from the mysticism of people like Hildegard. And I'm wondering today, I'm trying to condense this, the loss of art education in public schools in favor of scientific, because science and math, which are important, but it seems to me we've lost the balance, because it seems to me that it's only through arts that we can really access some of those higher order truths that you were referring to. The church mystics aren't embraced. I mean, Hildegard, even as we know, was viewed very suspiciously by her own community. I just wonder if you could comment on that tension between scientific, this is true, and the things that of higher order that sometimes can only be reached by poets and artists and musicians, of which Hildegard was also a musician as well as a scientist.
Thank you. Thank you for naming that. We can't put everything into words. We have to use other modes of expression at times. Mathematics is itself another form of expression. It's another schema or language, not unlike music, to express a different take on truth. I'm going to push back a little bit because I think science can invite us to look at higher order truth. In physics in particular, we see this progression of search for definitions, ways of understanding that push us beyond insisting that this chair is completely solid because that's what it feels like. We know that's not true at one level. It feels hard, feels solid, but I wholeheartedly support and encourage your sense that the arts are really important. That is what invites many people into an experience of something that transcends the literalness of much of daily living.
Fundamentalism, almost we've lost. I think fundamentalism has risen from that, and the arts have diminished. It almost seems like there's a cause and effect there. Maybe.
I think the arts are essential to human flourishing. I think science is essential to human flourishing. All this wide realm of human inquiry is essential. We can't discount any part of it, because it's more than any one of us will ever understand or comprehend. Yes?
Before I say this, please don't lynch me. White man's logic is what you're basing most of this on. And I have to tell you that it scares the hell out of me. Because as a woman, as a person who was abused as a child, and the truth, as I know it, is probably similar to your truths, whether you're a white man or not. I don't mean to be disparaging in any way. Some of my best friends are men. But science, I mean, I'm kind of in her camp with the arts being a better way to experience it. Because science and logic and all of those things, they're kind of misplaced in some ways when you're looking for truth. Truth is sometimes more about intuition.
Okay.
And it's not so much about scientific rigor.
Okay.
It's about what you feel, what and your experience. And culturally, I'm very open in that. But I struggle with why people think that God is going to fix things, why science is going to fix things. Seems to me we're out in the ocean in a raft, and if we don't fix it, it's not going to get fixed. But we can't agree on, what's right or wrong. So how do we fix it?
Thank you. Thank you.
I'm not sure what my question
To give it
is.
back to him. I think what you're getting at is the fact that different systems of knowing, different routes into wisdom, different ways of searching for truth, almost all of them have been misused. Almost all of them have been used to say, well, I have the fullness of truth and you're not part of it. Or this segment of creation is not part of it. What I'm trying to argue for is a higher order sense that incorporates the best of our varied ways of knowing, wisdom seeking, truth seeking, that will lead to the flourishing of all of what we know, all the good of what we know.
Right. I get that from you. But how do we make that a larger sense of reality?
Yeah. And I think that's
women.
including women. Amen, sister. Amen, sister.
For millennia, we've been taken away from writing politics and governments and owning businesses, being the head of anything. And that's through every religion,
Almost. Not quite.
Well, I don't know,
Almost.
not quite,
Yeah.
but for as long as for a very long time, and until we include more women in writing these things, educating, being the powerhouse, or being at an equal level, we're never going to do that universally around the world.
Yes, every part of what is has something to contribute to that whole,ness and has to be honored. Has to be honored.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
The number of books that women have written, or it's just, we've been so excluded in everything, and still are. So.
Me too.
It comes down to it. And we are a different chemistry. Without one, you cannot have the other. Period. So we are equal. And that gets right into physics.
Absolutely.
It's like yin and yang, or up and down, backwards. That's quantum mechanics. So it's yes, no, on, off. You can't. So.
And there's a range in humanity of what that looks like.
Yeah.
Yes. Here's a question here, and then we'll go back over there, and I'll back up so I can see people.
We have long believed that man is superior to woman, and we get that from the Bible and a lot of things. But the thing is that man tries to control women in the home. And obviously, to most of us, a woman runs the home, and she should be in command. And if she wants something done, she should be able to get it from her husband, or get help. But instead, we demand to have sex with our wives, and when they don't want to, well, we force them. We do things that are stupid, and And that isn't fair to women. They should be able to choose when they feel ready for that. And men, they have sex and they have no discipline. They pour their seed into any woman that'll let them. And we need to change the way we think. And that's what you're talking about.
Thank you. Thank you. And some of that's part of our evolutionary development, and part of our evolutionary development is supposed to be living up here rather than back here. Yeah.
Thank you for coming this evening.
You're welcome.
The thing that bothers me the most, looking around the room, there's more baby boomers than there are millennials. But I think this is the millennial view of truth. Well, it's my truth. That's what they say. Well, it's my truth. This is what I believe.
Okay.
And so, that's the generation coming up. That's the future. So how in the world are we ever going to get past that?
Didn't the baby boomer? Haven't the baby boomers said the same thing? I think it's part of our life cycle development. I think we have to start with what we know. All of us. Some of us stay there. Some of us keep searching for a wider and more expansive sense of what truth is. We cannot jump, most of us, and you see sometimes in terminally ill children rise to a level of the understanding of the interconnectedness of all that is that most of us never will reach. But most of us have the ability to keep growing towards something like that. Behind you.
I would like to say that I don't know whether truth is important anymore. I think what is far more important is love. Now, truth may be part of love, but if we're not engaging in that, there's all kinds of truths.
I think that truth is probably love is probably the deepest understanding of that. It's an expression of truth. It's about that faithfulness in relationship. It's about that central focus on what is and what is most important. It's a many splendored thing of many orders of magnitude. There, and then let's come across the room.
So to piggyback on that question and your response, and to go back to the beginning of your talk, you were talking about truth kind of, well, you had so many dimensions of that word in English, I can't remember them all. But I'm thinking of the one like, when something's true, like say a balance is true when it's truly balanced. So what I'm hearing you say in a sense is that love at the core of it has that sense of truth in that kind of way. Am I interpreting you right?
Yeah, it's about right relationship. It's about faithfulness, fidelity, all those dimensions of truth that are incorporated in that sense. That things that were covered up have been revealed, that we're not hiding things from one another. Our relationship is true and loving when it's open and communicating. Would you come across? Thank you.
Thank you. Is there a progression of truth from a zero order to the multidimensional? Is that where I thought I heard you respond to a previous question. Is that?
I think that's a piece of it. Not for all local truths, but I think there is an ability to expand a local truth If it partakes of a more universal sense, then yes. The fact of Martin Luther King's death date doesn't have a whole lot of applicability to a higher order truth, but his message does.
But if we can't agree on something simple, such as Martin Luther King's death date, is it possible to reach higher agreement on truth if we can't reach agreement on the basic truths? So I think that's a lot of what's happening in the world today, that we can't get here because we're not even close down here.
And that's one reason that I think telling our stories helps us to get to what we do share. Because if we're going to argue about whether President Obama had a birth certificate or not, that's a fruitless discussion for many people. But we can talk about our own family history and where we were born and what it means to know that our roots are here or our roots are there, and then maybe we begin to come to a place where we can talk about the importance of a life.
Yeah, so just given all your talk and some about your history, both in the church and science, you have a lot of experience, it seems, dealing with people who have different truths from yourself. How can we enter into a fruitful conversation with these people?
Again, I think it's about finding a shared humanity. There's so much about who we are that is common. And we tend to focus on what we don't like about this person over here, or the fact that it's a stranger. We can learn different behaviors if we're willing to look, if we're willing to search. And it requires a little bit of that uncomfortableness, that vulnerability, that willingness to see that there's to embrace a new idea. Mendel's genetics didn't instantaneously take the world by storm, nor did Darwin's theory. And it's still anathema in some places. But people took a risk to see the world in a new way or through a new lens. And the world got bigger as a result. No.
I don't need the mic, it's okay. So I'm struck by what this gentleman over here had to say, because he mentioned how the Bible says X, Y, and Z and defines behavior. And the Bible is obviously considered to be one source of great truth that we are supposed to be following diligently to the letter. Mm-hmm. So it sounded like his comment was, we need to rethink what the Bible tells us. Now it sounds like we're saying, well, we need to rethink what has for thousands of years been considered the absolute truth. Where are we headed here? I mean, I don't disagree, but I also think we're starting to unravel that thing that is supposed to be it, truth with a capital T.
We have always been reinterpreting. There have been many strands of interpretation that have led people to somewhat different conclusions about what the Bible says. Within the Bible itself, there are different understandings of what right relationship looks like. Polygamy is normative in most of the Bible. It really doesn't, it's not until property in the Middle Ages becomes so essential that marriages are made in church. Family codes of behavior have changed through time. There are many different examples in the Bible that are anathema to us today and weren't then. We've changed our minds about a lot of that. We've changed our hearts about it. We're searching, I believe, for a deeper understanding of the common roots that we all share. That we're human beings, and our forefathers who wrote the Declaration of Independence name them in ways that I don't think they expected ever to come to reality. But they transcend that time, and they still transcend what's real and possible in today's society.
So quick follow-up.
Yeah.
What order truth is the Bible?
I think it's a high order truth because it invites us continually to confront systems. The prophetic tradition in the Bible invites us to confront systems that want to use people as commodities, that want to control, that want to privilege some segment of society in controlling another segment of society, that want us to see ourselves as the center of the universe rather than the power that creates the universe, that gives life to things.
So which is a higher order truth, science or the Bible?
I think that's an unfruitful question.
Well, it's not really, because
I think there are different ways of seeking truth, and when they talk to each other, I think it's a much more productive conversation.
it just sounds like when you talk about how the Bible is so open to interpretation, and it has for so long been considered the highest order truth, I just don't understand how, if that relationship aspect of it is open for discussion, what else is open for discussion, and at what point does it start to lose its truth, and it really is just a relative guide?
What I find most fundamental in the Bible is love God with all you are and all you have, and love your neighbor as yourself. And we're still trying to figure out how to do that. And I think that's what the details of human life are about. There was a hand here.
I appreciate a lot of the different comments that have come across in those last few remarks, especially, when I think about the differences that a lot of people have commented on, it's usually a polar opposite, a polar extreme, right and left, yin and yang, whatever you want to call it. And when I think of us as people, we are not, on the record, we're not polar opposites. We're not two-dimensional people. We are n-dimensional people, and tend to square off in just one dimension. On opposite sides. And when I think about biblical truths and science, because I'm on both sides of that fence, because I've studied the biblical truths long and hard, and I've studied scientific truths as a mathematician and a physicist for a long time too. And they're not opposite.
Right.
They are the wisdom of I'm going to call God, whatever that is. And there is, we talk about the DNA of the universe. It comes back to our own DNA in trying to flesh out what we are fundamentally as humans. And that larger DNA of the universe, I don't know that we're so far removed from what we came from, our stories, because it is written in our DNA. You can see it. Your father had a heart attack, your friend had a heart attack, your mother had diabetes, with cancer. It's written in our DNA. And those aren't the only things that are written in our DNA. And so when I think about these conversations about who we are as a people and how we square off, the box gets too small. Really gets too small to have a discussion. And that loving part, as somebody mentioned earlier, love is a really healing force, especially when you're dealing in polar extremisms. What is it that somebody wrote at one time, that love is what crosses that divide between us. It builds that bridge. It's what love does, because there's always going to be a divide, because it's really separate entities. And that cooperative cooperation of solving the problems, as you say. You saw how we're going to fix this. I don't know that there's any fixing this. It's inherent in the world. It's a mess. It's always been a mess. Probably always going to be a mess, because it's the fertile soil in which we grow, which we change, and which we develop. So when you talk about truth and you talk about biblical truths, those fundamental truths, you go back to some of those big, what is truth, right? It's a big popular question between some of the biblical scholars in the Bible and some of the, flaky politicians in the Bible, right? What is truth? We're all searching for it, but I don't know. When you say fundamentally, what are we talking about? It was a dot. Did Martin Luther King die on that day? Did hold on my birth certificate? Was I born on this continent? Was I born on another one? What are we supposed to be doing here? What are we for? And that's a bigger truth that I think goes on beyond just, I'm a female, you're a male. I was born here, you were born there. I'm a mathematician, you're an anthropologist, I don't have an education. I was never given that privilege of it all. Those are opportunities where love comes into play to cross that divide. He violated me. And I'm wounded. And I actually perpetrator be a victim. But I don't want to hate unless I become it, right? It's a common thing, right? So I appreciate all your comments, and I especially love those comments about truth. But when you get to DNA of truth, it's really rich topic.
Thank you. Thank you. Up there and then down here.
Thank you for your presentation. I really enjoyed the comments about science and mysticism being parts of the same truth. I wanted to ask you if you'd share some more stuff, which is in your journey from Stanford to where you are now. I was wondering how you see politics and power as the opposite of truth. And the fact that you've invited us to tell stories to disambiguate all of these things and explicate them. We look at the stories in the Jewish tradition, and then we look at the stories in the Christian tradition, and then we look at our own lives and how what we're living through is a story right now, if you think of it. And how would we tell grandchildren about what happened now? And why was Guantanamo Bay kept open? So in some ways, I'm wondering how you have dealt with this in your own career, in your own personal life. And what is it that we would take away? Because politics is about ignoring truth in some ways. Whoever is in power, whether it is the popes or whether it is regimes in the civil domain, we've got that conflict going on often. And I think the challenge for me is to think about situations where truth trumped political power.
Thank you. Thank you. I don't see politics and power as opposite to truth. Politics is about the art of living together in community. We see it as a dirty word often in English. Spanish has two words for politics. Política, politics. Politiquería, dirty politics. Which I think is very helpful. Politics is necessary. We can't decide what to have for dinner in a group of 5 without some negotiation if we're going to cook in the same kitchen. It's about expressing my local truth and listening to your local truths and finding something that can embrace that. At its best, politics invites people not to a lowest common denominator, but to a higher order of truth that will serve the community more effectively. That the community might flourish better than it did without that. That's the genius of something like the Declaration of Independence. It keeps pushing us in ways that we haven't yet addressed. because we haven't lived up to it. In my own life, I have been called in, I can't talk about it really in ways other than that. My heart has led me to explore the wonder of the creatures in the sea, to discover how to reorient the gifts I learned as a scientist into working in human communities on behalf of, and now on behalf of the whole of what we know as creation. I'm searching as much as anybody for a fuller and clearer understanding of where it is I'm going. And I hope I'm doing the best I can to listen, not only in my own heart, but to the community around me about where that needs to be going. It's in hearing other people's stories and, reading history and discovering how people have engaged the punitive side of political power in ways that are constructive. And I see that in Jesus' nonviolence and Martin Luther King's nonviolence and in Gandhi's nonviolence by developing humorous responses to ignominious decisions. We can deflate that kind of overinflated power by poking it in the right way. Right? There was, here.
So I think we know that humans are all extremely good at failing, and I think that's one of the biggest things that makes us human. One of the things that you mentioned in your talk was getting to a point where everyone's living in peace, where everyone's living together in harmony, which I would consider something where you're no longer failing. Mm-hmm. So if you got to that place, is that a place that would kind of strip us of our humanity? Or is it more of a truth where, is that something to strive for in humanity, in still being human? Or is there another truth that we should follow?
I think in as much as it is possible, I think most human beings have experiences of that kind of peace, even if it's for a few minutes, or a day, or an hour. What happens when we're in a state like that? It's joy. It feels like real life to most of us. What would that look like if everybody was experiencing that at the same time? To me, it's what deep creativity is about. What might happen if we weren't arguing about the details and trying to figure out what art and music and mathematics and politics are all saying about this? Without the defensiveness and the jockeying that we often do. I don't think it would make us unhuman or less human. I think it would make us more deeply human. Yeah, Mary Kate.
It seems to me that there's a conversion, and I mean that much more broadly than religious conversion, to, as individuals, to believe with all that we are the truth. Doesn't need to be protected, but it does need to be pursued together. Not just pursued, but pursued together. And the truth can take right. Just about anything. But what led me to that today is interesting. I was reading the paper this morning, and there's some follow-up on the testimony, and then also some other articles in Christian journals about one woman's testimony in particular in the Larry Nassar case. Just painful testimony. It was in the sports page, not the front page. And I wondered about that, and I thought, well, maybe some editor decided it actually needed to be in the sports page as opposed to the front page. Because there's something in there the truth of what happened can stand being hid on the side of the whatever Steve did at basketball last night. The truth that can stand it, and there's some conversion that's happening in it being there. That might be idle. But in the end, I was glad it was there. So.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, the truth doesn't disappear. It reemerges sometimes in surprising ways, and sometimes in the midst of great pain.
And that's Dr. King's beautiful line, the moral arc bends toward justice, that confidence is that having had that moment of convergence. The truth can take it.
And truth is about confidence. Yes.
My question is kind of about the intertwining of truth and morality, because it does seem as though throughout our entire conversation, and certainly in your discussion as well, that there are those points of truth that seem to be just the fact of Martin Luther King Jr.'s death date, which people could still disagree with. But then we start to get into, as we're working through to a higher truth, there becomes a lot more moral judgment placed on what one person may see as their truth or an other's truth, right? Especially when we're talking about someone who is other than us. And through our conversations of truth, morality, both of those kind of seem to climb together. I'm just wondering if you can speak a little bit about the relationship between truth, morality, the judgments placed on that, and then do you see kind of the umbrella, big T truth, ultimate truth as one that surpasses moral judgment because it is, and so...
Yes and no. I think that the higher order truth embraces human activity, which is what morality is about. And we judge the morality of particular behavior out of that higher order sense of what is ultimately true, right, just, what's faithful, what's congruent. Does that...
But we're still using our own judgment, and it's still happening in that community.
Of course, and our justice system, at least in this part of the world, is predicated on a sense that one person doesn't decide. Even if a judge makes a decision, he or she is basing that on a history, on a wisdom tradition of the law in this place about these kinds of things. In a trial, a decision is made based on the moral judgment of a group of people who are supposed to be relatively like the person who is being judged. It's far from perfect, but it is a way of enfleshing the sense that the judgment is exercised by people with experience of the wider community and of the local context of the person who's involved.
Yeah, absolutely. And I certainly think that that's really where a lot of scientific knowledge, for those in a position to, well, for all of us, to learn about what is true for the world as it is evolving. So when we do talk about some of the scientific truths of, this, it may seem hard, but we know that fire will melt it, it can change. Knowing how fluid the world actually is, I think can really help to inform that. Which is why I think science is extremely important to perceiving just how fluid our experiences truly are. Yes, I see it very intertwined. I'm happy to have your thoughts on it too.
Yeah, and at the same time, we can perceive a trajectory in what moral truth looks like. There's a biblical warrant that says an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Some people see that as have understood that as permitting, if you put my out, I can take yours out too. It's meant to be a limit on retribution. If someone injures you, you cannot do any more damage than that person did to you. You can't kill the person. It's meant to impose a limit on tribal justice seeking. That's one stage in moral development. We're not there anymore, we hope. But even though sometimes our justice system operates that way. Jean?
Thanks, Katharine. Is this on?
Yes.
Oh, okay, there we go. I'm curious how you see the intersection of truth and hope. And where I'm coming from, I'll try to make this very succinct, but it's a bit complex. But I'm not thinking biblically right now. I'm thinking of Tolkien, and I'm thinking of Frodo, and Gollum fighting over the ring. Neither of them wants it to be destroyed, but it ends up being destroyed. And that Tolkien has this concept, which he actually writes about in some of his essays, where sometimes everybody striving to do something grasping for themselves ends up creating the greater good.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see, how this plays out in that myth, but nobody ever blames Frodo.
Right.
For the fact that he failed,
mm-hmm.
right? And Gandalf, who is really kind of the carrier of all this in that myth, both truth and hope are deeply intertwined, because that's a truth to him.
Mm-hmm.
And he is the espouser of hope throughout the whole thing. And it turns out that it works.
Mm-hmm.
It's not perfect,
right.
but it works. So I'm curious if you've thought about that intersection and what your thoughts are.
Absolutely. I think we pursue truth because we have hope. And that pursuing truth strengthens that sense of hope. When we find confirmation, when we find congruence with other human beings who are going in the same direction. If you never got any positive feedback, you would probably not continue. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And even in the face of that, people may have this deep well of understanding, like Martin Luther King, that he was going in the right direction, even though he knew it was where it was taking him.
Yeah.
And 50 odd years later, we're not a whole lot farther ahead, but we are some farther ahead on that road.
So are those like twins or brother and sister, or is there any analogy that way that's actually useful to help us in that?
I think they're part of the same reality. It's part of the universe's DNA, if you will.
I wonder where physicists then they talk a lot about truth, right? Or scientists do, but where would hope fit in that paradigm?
Hope is related to the ongoing creativity of the universe. What will be has not yet unfolded. And we don't know what will be.
Interesting.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.